Time for us to begin Bible class. I fully know what a chicken with his head cut off feels like this morning. They decided to close 4 of the 5 lanes on I-40 this morning coming over. And so they took us from 4 lanes down into 1. And so that was a bit of an adventure. I think they did it just to see if they could do it. I think that was what was going on there. But we are in our study of Exodus. We started last week. We looked at some introductory material last week with regards to Moses being the author, not just of Exodus, but of the Pentateuch, those first 5 books, the law of Moses. And so we looked at the authorship of Moses and some evidences for that. We talked about the time period, and we looked at some archaeological evidence and some historical evidence that gives us an idea of the time period that we're looking at here, that with regards to them coming out of Egypt, we're looking at 1446 roughly BC for the time of the Exodus there. And there's some other things that we want to understand here about the book overall before we get started in chapter 1. There are some key lessons that the book of Exodus teaches us. It teaches us things about God, that God has power over nature. And we'll see that with regards to the plagues on Egypt when the Nile River turns to blood. We'll see that with regards to the tempest that God calls up, the hail and the lightning and all of that, and the darkness upon the earth. For 3 days. And so God has power over nature. We'll see that God has power over nations. At this particular time, there's one superpower in the world, and it's Egypt. But God's got more power than Egypt does. God's got more power than Pharaoh does. And so God is able to rule, if you will, over Egypt. He's able to rule over Israel. He's able to rule over Moab and Ammon and other places that the Israelites are going to travel. We see that God has a right to choose Israel as his people. He has a right to choose them, to pick them out of everybody in the world to be his people, and doesn't pick them because they're the strongest, doesn't pick them because they're the mightiest. As a matter of fact, they're probably the weakest. And that's probably why God picks them, because the only way that they're going to be victorious in all of this is if God is with them. And he's got his ability to care for and to defend Israel. We'll see that. So concerning God, we'll see those things within Exodus itself. Concerning man, redemption. Right? Redemption is the big thing that comes out of Exodus. That he's going to redeem his people who are in slavery to the Egyptians. And they're in a slavery that they can't get out of themselves. They're in a situation where they can't possibly get out of that themselves. And there's a parallel there with regards to us and our redemption, that he has bought us back from slavery to sin. Because there's no way that we could get out of that slavery ourselves. That redemption is necessary. And so if we're going to have fellowship with God, that redemption has to happen. And that's a common thread in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that redemption is necessary. And that's part of God's mission, isn't it? What was God's mission from the very beginning? Well, it was to redeem man. He made man. Man was with him in the garden. Man fell, and the rest of the story is all about the redemption of man. And so here in this part of the story, he's going to be redeeming Israel from that slavery. Now, in order to have redemption, what do we have to be? Obedient, right? In order to have redemption, obedience is necessary. That's true with regards to the Israelites here. That's true with regards to us. If we are going to have redemption, redemption is only secured through obedience. And obedience should be our response to faith, through our faith. And then those who are redeemed are to serve God and to have reverence for God. And we'll see that in Exodus, especially with regards to the 10 Commandment law and all the other commands that are given, that here's what it is that they need to do, right, in order to revere and to serve God. This is what God wants, and this is how God wants to be served. And it's the same way when we become Christians. When our sin problem, when our slavery to sin is, when we're redeemed from that, right? That we should want to revere God and serve God in the way that He wants to be served. There's some key words that we see over and over again in the book. The people, right? The idea of nations, you've got God's people, and then you've got the people that are going to be around them, right? The Egyptian people. The idea of holiness is important in the book of Exodus, that God wants His people to be holy. Why? Because God is holy. And you see it a lot more when you get to Leviticus, but this idea of holiness is here, that they're being set apart, right? The idea of holiness is sanctification or being set apart. And the Israelites are going to be set apart. We'll see that even when we get to the plagues, that what happens to Egypt doesn't happen to Israel, right? The plagues affect Egypt, but they don't affect Israel. And so they are to be set apart from those that are around them. We'll talk about the names of God, and especially Yahweh, when we get into chapters 3 and following, that God's going to reveal Himself through that name Yahweh, that they hadn't known that name before. He's going to give them the land. He's going to lead them to the land. He's going to lead them to the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And so in fulfillment of that, He's going to lead them to that land. Some key phrases that are in the book as well. God will over and over again say, I am the Lord. He wants them to understand and not make any mistake about who it is that He is. Right? I am the Lord. I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. And when you read from Exodus on, over and over again, God's going to remind them through the prophets, I'm the Lord. I brought you out of Egypt. I'm the one who did all of these things, so that they would have this constant remembrance of God has done all of this for us, so then what should our response to that be? And certainly in the New Testament, God has sent His Son to die for our sins. He's done a lot for us, and so we need to think about how that impacts our life. God wants them to know who He is. He says, I am the Lord. We're going to see a repetition of a phrase, as the Lord commanded Moses, especially in the last 20 chapters. Because He's going to give him the instructions for the tabernacle. He's going to give him the instructions for the priests. He's going to give him instructions for the priest garments. He's going to give him instructions for the table of showbread and for the Ark of the Covenant and all those things that are in the tabernacle and all those things that Moses was to do as the Lord commanded Moses. Why is that important?
It shows his obedience.
It shows Moses' obedience, right? That he did as the Lord commanded. What else does it show us? Whose idea was the Ten Commandments? It was God's, right? Whose idea was the tabernacle and all the furnishings? It was God, right? So it's important that all this comes from God. This isn't Moses saying, hey, I think this would be a great way of organizing a religion, right? When Moses writes these things down, it's as the Lord commanded to Moses, or the Lord spoke to Moses, right? And so it shows the hand of God in this, that this isn't something that's man-made, that this isn't just Moses saying, here's what it is that I think is going on here. There's some other things that foreshadow the New Testament. You've got the priesthood and the tabernacle that are kind of a foreshadowing of the church. That here's, the house of God, if you will, this tabernacle that's here. This is where God is going to meet with His people, or He's going to meet with the high priest there. There's going to be some restrictions to that, but it's kind of foreshadowing the fact that we come together and we meet with the Lord in the church. Now, understand it's not the building, right? It's the people. But that we are priests of God, where there were Levitical priests under the Mosaic system. And so there's a foreshadowing of that. The idea of worshiping God correctly. Do you think that there's some emphasis on here's what it is that you do, here's how it is that you do it, and here's how you carry this out? And there's a lot of detail, and we're going to notice that there's a lot of detail in what it is that God wants. People today say, well, it doesn't really matter how you worship God. God doesn't care about the details. When we read through books like Exodus and Leviticus and we see all the detail that is there with regards to worship, you can't come to the conclusion that God doesn't care about the details of how we worship Him. Right? God cares about those details because He puts all of that out there. The idea of law, that there are laws. There's a Ten Commandment law. There's, if you say, well, we have to follow the Ten Commandments, well, understand that there's 600 and some commands in the Mosaic Law. It's not just 10 commands. There's 600 and some commandments that are in there. And so if we're going to interact with God and we're going to do it in a way that's pleasing to God, that interaction always takes place according to law. There's always been law. Even back in the patriarchal time period, right? They weren't to eat of a certain tree. There was a law that they were to follow. In the Mosaic system, the Jews were to follow the laws that are going to be stipulated. And we're not under the Mosaic law today, but what law do we have?
Perfect law of liberty.
Perfect law of liberty, right? James chapter 1, I think verse 25, says that we have a perfect law of liberty. In Galatians, it tells us to bear one another's burdens in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. And why to do that? So fulfill the law of Christ. Right? So there's got to be law, because without law there can't be any sin. There can't be any transgression if there's no law. And so we're under law, but we're under a different law. Now, we're not saved by law. We're not saved by a system of law. We're saved by a system of grace. And so what we have under the New Testament is better than what they had, because they couldn't be saved by the law. And the writer of Hebrews points that out in great detail. And then we got a parallel between Moses and Jesus. That both of them are lawgivers, both of them are prophets. Moses is told to write that God at some point is going to raise up another prophet like Moses, right, who's going to come and redeem his people. And that's a foreshadowing of Jesus. There's a parallel there with Jesus. Any comments or questions on any of the introductory stuff? We're going to see all of this going on here in the book of Exodus. All right, if not, we'll pick up in chapter 1. It says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already." And so we have a listing here of the tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel back in Genesis. And so these are his children. Now, the giving of the names here are in order of their birth, and it's also broken down by the 4 different women that Jacob had children with. There's Leah and Rachel, and then 2 concubines here. And so Joseph's name is not mentioned with Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, because it's the text tells us he was already down here in Egypt. And it says, "Joseph died and all of his brothers and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." So Joseph brought them into Egypt. He was sold into slavery. He ends up being second in charge of Pharaoh's household. And he has an interpretation of Pharaoh's dream about the cows, the skinny cows and the fat cows. And so they stored up grain during the years of plenty so that they could get through the famine. Right? And so everyone had to come to them in order to get food, and the Israelites come to them to get food, and the Israelites come, and they end up settling this land of Goshen, which in Genesis 47:11 is also referred to as the land of Ramses. Now, in Genesis 47, it's long before Ramses ever becomes Pharaoh, and so it looks like there's an area there that's referred to as being the area of Ramses long before that, so that we don't have to tie this Exodus time period to Ramses' pharaohship. But they came down into the land, and so here they are. And so Joseph and that generation, they pass away. But as time goes on, now we're not told exactly how much time takes place here, but between the death of Joseph and what's going to take place here in Exodus with the birth of Moses, we're looking at a time gap of about 260 years or so. So they grow during this time period. They grow into a great nation, which is one of the things that God had promised Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12, that he was going to make of Abraham a great nation, or that nations were going to come from him. Well, through Ishmael, you've got the Midianites and the Ishmaelites who come to be, but also through Isaac, you've got the nation of Israel that is being formed here, that they continue to grow, and the land was filled with them. God had promised Abraham that he was going to bless him, right? And we see in the Old Testament times that a blessing normally meant that they were going to be fruitful, that they were going to multiply, that they were going to be abundant, if you will, in children and grandchildren. Now, in verse 8 it says, "There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies, fight against us, and so go up out of the land.'" So there's another Pharaoh that rises up, and he doesn't know Joseph. Now, the Pharaoh before, who knew Joseph and allowed Joseph to be part of his court, well, he was blessed because God told Abraham, "I'm going to bless those who bless you." Well, Joseph was blessed by Pharaoh. Pharaoh's household was blessed by the fact that Joseph was part of it. But now Joseph is gone, and there's another Pharaoh who arises, and this looks to be the beginning of the 18th dynasty. If you were here last week, we talked about where this fits with Egyptian history, potentially. And so you've got the first native dynasty in several hundred years. They don't like foreigners, and so they're going to see the Israelites as a threat. Because the nation of Israel, well, they are living in Goshen. And Goshen is, if you look at the map of Egypt, it's kind of in the upper right-hand section of Egypt. And anybody that's going to invade them, any invasion that's going to come against Egypt is going to come through that Fertile Crescent, and it's going to come down through Palestine, and it's going to come down through Goshen. And they're concerned that because the Israelites continue to multiply, and when it says that they're mightier than them, don't think that they're a mighty fighting force, because Israel, they're a bunch of shepherds. They're a bunch of farmers. They're not soldiers. They don't have an army. It's just that there's a vast number of them. And they say, all these people, you know, when the enemy comes in, if some Canaanite nation comes in, well, these guys are Canaanites. They're Semitic people, and they're probably going to join up with them and attack us. And so they're concerned about this. And again, this looks like it fits with the beginning of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. And so he says, let us deal shrewdly with these folks, right? And so here's what they're going to do. In verse 11, he says, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So Pharaoh says, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll get them to stop multiplying. We'll give them so much work to do that they won't have time maybe to multiply. They won't have energy to multiply. That they put them under hard labor and under bondage to them. And he thinks that that's going to solve his problem. But it doesn't, right? Can't defeat God's plan. God's got a plan here for bringing his people out of Egypt. God's got a plan here for all of this taking place. And this is all happening as part of God's mission, because it looks like the Israelites have come down into Egypt, they have settled down here in Egypt, and they've gotten comfortable in Egypt. Well, being put under slavery and being put under bondage is going to make them uncomfortable. It's going to make them want to leave Egypt. Now, how do we know that Egypt's having a bad influence on them? Well, come over to Joshua chapter 24. This is much later in our story. This is after the conquest of the land of Israel. And in Joshua chapter 24, Joshua is giving his farewell speech. He's getting ready to pass on to the next generation, and they have done what they were supposed to do. And they're going to pass the work on to the next generation in order for them to do that. But notice in Joshua chapter 24, if somebody would read verse 14.
Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your father served before the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord.
Okay, so Joshua tells them, you need to choose today who you're going to serve. You need to serve the Lord, and if you're going to serve the Lord, then you got to put away the gods that your father served on the other side of the river. Well, that's talking about where Abraham came from, right? The other side of the river. Usually when you see the river, it's in reference to the Euphrates. You know, put away the gods that your father served on the other side of the river. So apparently they're still practicing some idolatry that came over from Abraham's people there in the land of Ur. But also he says, put away the gods that you served in Egypt. So at the end of Joshua's life, he's telling them that they still need to put away this idolatry, that they still need to put away these idols that they've brought with them from Egypt. And so Egypt looks like it was having a bad influence on them. It's part of God's mission for them to leave. Now, the timing wasn't right when he told Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. In Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16, he says, but not yet, right? In the fourth generation, they're going to come out of there because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So there's a time period, and it's going to happen according to God's time period, but it's time for them to leave Egypt. And so God's going to make it so that they're ready to go, that they're ready to leave Egypt, that they're motivated, if you will, to leave. And does persecution motivate people? Do you think persecution motivates people? Are they going to be ready to leave Egypt when the time comes? Now, they're going to forget that, right? When they get out into the wilderness and things aren't as a primrose path like they thought it was going to be, right? When they get out in the wilderness, they forget about how bad things were in Egypt. They want to go back to that, but they're going to want to leave Egypt, right? And persecution motivates. Did persecution motivate this church in the first century? It spread, right? The persecution actually helped them spread because why? In the first 7 chapters of the book of Acts, where are they? They're in Jerusalem, right? And maybe they're comfortable here in Jerusalem and we're happy here in Jerusalem. But the persecution causes them to be spread into Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And that was God's plan. Jesus told the disciples in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, you're going to be witnesses to me in all these places. Well, persecution helped them spread to those areas. And even though they were persecuted, what did the church do? They took the word with them, but did that shut the church down? No, they grew, right? They multiplied. They didn't just add, right? They multiplied. And so the church grew in a time of persecution, and it separates the wheat from the chaff. It separates the men from the boys, if you will. You got to be all in if you're going to face persecution and come through that. It makes the church stronger. And so they afflict them with these burdens, but it doesn't work. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, the text says. Verse 13, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. And so they made them serve in mortar and in brick. They were brick makers. They would take clay and they would take some vegetable matter, which was usually straw, or in some cases later on it's going to end up being stubble. But they would take all of that and they would put maybe some sand in that and they would form it into a square and they'd let it bake in the sun, and that would bake into bricks, and they would use those bricks for building. And so they're going to put them into hard labor doing all of these things. Now, a lot of times in the movies and in the pictures, you see them, they're being whipped and they're carrying ropes and they're pulling these huge stones. We don't have any indication that they were doing that. I mean, it's possible that they were, but the text doesn't tell us that. But it tells us that they served with rigor. In Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 20, when Moses is recounting this time period, he refers to Egypt as an iron furnace, that God brought you out of the iron furnace of Egypt. And if you've ever worked in a place where there's iron furnace, I took a tour one time of a steel plant, and the immense size of it is amazing, first off. But secondly, the heat, that they heat the steel up to about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit when they're making steel. And so it gets pretty warm inside there. And so when you think of an iron furnace, you think about the oppression of that it's even hard to breathe. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, right? So none of this is working. So he's put them under rigor, he's put them under bondage, he's put them into slavery, and they're still multiplying. And so we've got to come up with a plan B. And so it says Pharaoh here, that the king of Egypt in verse 15, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. We wonder about who the Pharaoh is at this time. The text doesn't tell us, the text doesn't name who Pharaoh is. And the text doesn't give us a name of Pharaoh's daughter. But you know whose names we do have? We have the names of these 2 Hebrew midwives. Sometimes people look at the Bible and they say, well, it's history. Well, if it's just written for the purpose of history, we might say it's poor history. Because here's a leader of the lone superpower, and we don't know what his name is, right? It'd be like having a history book and there's one sentence on Abraham Lincoln that just says, oh, he was president during the Civil War, right? We would consider that to be poor history. But God's not interested in just history for the sake of history. He's interested in his people. Right? And so his people take front and center rather than other historical figures that we might think were more important. But he mentions the names of these two Hebrew midwives. So here's what Pharaoh decides to do. He says, all right, when the Hebrew people, when they have children, I'm going to get these midwives involved. Now they're Hebrew midwives, right? So he wants them to kill their own people, is what he's asking them to do. And he says, when they are on the stools, literally it's two stones. You kind of had a stone and a stone, and you would stand or put your feet on those two stones, or the women would when they were giving birth. And so when you see them on the birth stools there, and if the child that is born to them is a male child, then you kill it. Why do you think they want to kill just the male children? All right, they're going to have a hard time growing as a nation, right? If there's no males to mate with the females, then the females are going to maybe have Egyptian children instead of Israelite children. And warriors, right? The male children could grow up to be warriors or grow up to be soldiers at some point. But the female children, well, they're not going to do that. They're going to be servants. They may be wives, right? They may be concubines, other things. And so they're just interested here in getting rid of the male children. And so he issues this order to the Hebrew midwives to kill these male children. In verse 17 it says, but the midwives feared God, did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. Now notice there in verse 17 it says they didn't do what Pharaoh commanded them, right? Are we supposed to obey the government? In the book of Romans, doesn't it tell us that we're supposed to obey the government?
Insofar as it does not disagree with God's command.
Right. There's a point at which we can't go along with the government, right? They can't go along with the government here because what the government's telling them to do is against God's will. It's against God's law, right? There's a higher law that's involved here. And so they feared God, right? They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh may have decided to kill them physically, but don't give up your physical life, right? Or don't preserve your physical life and give up your spiritual life. They made a choice here, right, to fear God. And it says they feared God. They didn't do as Pharaoh told them to, but it says they saved the male children alive. Now, the phrase there that they saved the male children alive, what does that mean? It means that they saw that they were male children. They were still doing the job of a Hebrew midwife, right? They were still doing the job of helping with the birth process. And when they saw that they were male children, they didn't kill them. They allowed them to live. That they preserved the male children alive. So in verse 18, the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and he said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Now, I've seen some commentators say that, well, the midwives here didn't lie, that they just delayed in coming and the birth process had taken place before they got there. Well, if that's the case, they're not doing their job as midwives, first off. And secondly, what are you going to do with the phrase that we saw in verse 17, that they saved the male children alive? That they seem to be involved in that. So to say that they're being truthful here in their answer and what it is they're given, well, they just delayed so they couldn't, I think it's kind of a way of weaseling out of this because we maybe don't want to deal with this issue. Because this looks to be a lie. And
It's no different from Rahab.
it's no different from Rahab. Right.
In other words, there appears to be, I don't know how to get around this, there appears to be a righteous kind of lie. I don't know
Well,
how to get away. Say any other way.
Yeah, so I mean, does God condone lying? Is God okay with lying? And that's the question that comes up. Is situational ethics, is that is that okay? That in this particular instance, well, what they're doing, the end justifies the means and it's okay for them to lie. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. I don't think God is okay with lying. It tells us that they lied. It tells us what they said, and it doesn't make any kind of moral judgment on that. And I don't think it makes a moral judgment on Rahab's lie either. It tells us the facts that this is what happened. Now, notice it says, Pharaoh calls for them. He says, "Why have you done this and saved them?" And so they say, "Well, they give birth before we get there," which looks to me to be a lie. In verse 20 it says, "Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them." So the midwives are involved in helping people with birth, and God's going to reward them by giving them households, by giving them children. These two women, Shiphrah and Puah, that are mentioned here. But what does God commend them for? Because the midwives feared God. He's not providing for them, and he's not rewarding them, and he's not bringing their names up or having their names recorded for us because he's happy that they lied. What God is happy about is that they feared him more than they feared Pharaoh, and that they kept God's law, and even though Pharaoh was commanding them to do something else.
In other words, in God's view, it was all right.
Well,
How can you explain it any other way?
I don't know that God was all right with the lie, because God,
It's all right with the outcome.
he was all right with the outcome.
Yeah.
He was all right with the fact that they feared God, but I don't think he was okay with them. I don't think God condones their lying. That would still be something that,
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree that.
I think the part would be if they would have been truthful in that moment, they should have had the faith that God would have provided the case. That would have been the next step.
yeah. They could have said, like kind of when Nebuchadnezzar has the idol and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they're not bowing down to it, and they say, "We're not going to bow down to it."
Or even Peter, whenever he's told to stop talking about Jesus and the resurrection, he said,
Yeah.
"No, listen, God is
We have to obey God and not man, right? Acts chapter 5 and verse 20 something.
not to talk."
Yeah, no. And so people want to make this kind of dilemma. They say, well, okay, well, what if, right? And Rahab too. Rahab is commended. Well, why is Rahab commended? Well, the text tells us that Rahab was commended because she received the spies in peace, right? She didn't turn them in. She received them in peace and she sent them on their way. But Rahab is not commended for her lying either. And so people want to look at the Hebrew midwives and they want to look at Rahab and they want to try to make a case to say today, right, that it's okay for us to lie if the circumstances are all right. It's all right for us to steal if we're starving and the circumstances warrant that. And this idea of situational ethics is something that the Bible doesn't teach. The Bible teaches us this is what's right, and what's right is always right. And this is what's wrong, and what's wrong is always wrong. And it doesn't matter the circumstances. And people want to make this, they want to try to make this false dilemma, right? To say, okay, well, what are you going to do if somebody comes to your door and they've got a gun and they say, where are your wife and your daughter at? And they say, well, in that case, it'd be okay to lie and tell them they're not here. I say, why do you even have to answer the question? Right? Am I forced to be truthful in that moment and say, oh yeah, they're upstairs and then they're in this bedroom and here's the key, right? Do I have to furnish all of that information? I can say nothing. I can choose not to answer the question whatsoever. It's a false dilemma to say, well, in that situation, you've got to lie. I can just say, I'm not going to tell you where they are.
Jesus remained quiet.
There were times where Jesus didn't answer the question, right? Not every question has to be answered, right? And so I heard, and this has got to be a made-up story because it's so fantastic. It's got to be a made-up story. But this man, he was a Christian, and he was captured by Muslims, and they were questioning him, and they were interrogating him, and they asked him whether or not he believed in Jesus. And he's worried that if he tells them that, yes, he believes in Jesus, he's worried that they're going to kill him or they're going to do something to him as a Christian, that they're going to persecute him in some way or maybe behead him. And so he tells them, no, I'm, and they say, well, we thought you were. We were pretty sure you were a Christian. You don't believe in Jesus? And he said, he swears up and down, no, I don't believe in Jesus. And they look at him and say, so then you're a Jewish spy. Didn't make his situation any better, right? Now, again, it's got to be a made-up story. But in the book of Revelation, they're dealing with persecution, and they're actually dealing with the Roman Empire coming in and putting a sword to their throat and telling them that they need to burn incense to Caesar, or that they need to confess Caesar, if you will, or they are going to be put to death. And what does the book of Revelation tell them? Be faithful unto death, and you will receive a crown of life. Don't give up your spiritual life, which lasts for eternity, to preserve. Jacob mentions, our life is a vapor, right? It's brief.
What this stuff proves, in my view, is that God is absolutely consistent, and we, in our behavior, are not, and need His forgiveness when that lack of consistency leads into sin.
Yeah.
Lying.
Well, when we lied to save ourselves, right?
Or to save others.
But we're relying on human and worldly faculties,
Yes.
right? Rather than relying upon God. If we have faith in God, we don't have to lie,
Yep.
right?
Jesus never lied.
No. And He's the goal, right? And He's what we ought to strive for. When it talks about, in Proverbs, it says, 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination to Him. The first of those is what? Is it a proud look, or is it a lying tongue that's first? Well, anyway, the lying tongue is in there, right? But then He also mentions those who bear false witness. Well, what's that? Bearing false witness. So 2 of the 7, right, are lying. And then in Revelation, it tells us that the liars are going to have their place in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. So God doesn't condone lying. God's not okay. And we might say, well, it's just a little lie, right? Shows like the Andy, and I love the Andy Griffith Show, don't get me wrong. But does the Andy Griffith Show teach situational ethics? That it's okay to lie to not hurt Barney's feelings, to tell him he's got a special microphone and he just needs to whisper, right? Or to tell Aunt Bee that they love her pickles, right? Because they don't want to hurt her feelings. A lie is a lie, right? And we might think, well, that's just a little white lie. It's just a little thing. What Satan told Eve in the Garden of Eden was just a little lie. And we might say, well, how much could that little lie hurt? You look at the world that we live in, and all the sin that is here, and all the hardship that's here, and all the diseases that are here, and the fact that we're going to pass away and die sometime, we're going to lose loved ones. How did that all come about? Because of one lie. And we don't always see the impact of that, but God does. God sees the end from the beginning. And so to God, that's a big deal. Comments or questions on these things?
But Dale, I think it's interesting that by not giving Pharaoh's name, and giving the midwives' names, the emphasis is on them, right? Because you know them, they're relatable, it's more personal. And they're the center of the story, not the leader of the Egyptians.
Yeah. This particular instance, they're front and center more so than Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh's plan is defeated, right? Now, Pharaoh's mighty, right? He's the leader of the lone superpower. And these Hebrew midwives, they're powerless against him from a worldly perspective, right?
And I think it shows that Pharaoh may not have been the brightest guy in the world either, asking 2 Hebrew women to kill Hebrew children.
Well, yeah, not the best of plans, probably, yeah. Unless he thinks that they fear him enough that they're going to do this. But God defeats Pharaoh, right? Over and over again, God defeats Pharaoh. In all of this, God defeats Pharaoh. And we see that over and over, and we'll see that over and over through the first part of Exodus here. So the fact that it tells us that the Hebrew midwives here lied about this, and it tells us that Rahab lied, and it tells us about David and his sins, and it tells us about Noah, right, becoming drunk after. I think that's evidence that this is written by God. Because if it was written by man, the heroes would be perfect, right? They wouldn't have any flaws. But they're human. They've got flaws. They make mistakes. Now, what they wanted to do, their intentions were the best of intentions, right? And God is pleased with their intentions, that they fear him instead of fearing Pharaoh. But it doesn't mean that they go about doing it in the right manner, if you will, with regards to them being dishonest.
Could you imagine being the author, like the physical author, having to write it, knowing that you're writing things that go against God's command?
Well, imagine being...
Things that God hates, like a lie or something like that.
Yeah. Well, imagine being, the prophet that's writing about David's, maybe Nathan, right, writing about David's sin with Bathsheba, and penning that.
Well, again, it's truth. It's truth.
It's truth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's truth. So it has to be written.
It has. Yes. Yeah.
And God would have to bail him out.
Yeah, twice he lied about Sarah being his sister. Now, she was technically, right? But she was also his wife, and so he was leaving out a big chunk of that. Yeah. Deception, yeah. And again, it was because he was afraid for his physical life, right? It was because he was afraid of his physical life.
In a way, what the midwives were doing was deception. I mean, they were just saying that they showed up too late.
Well, yeah, I mean, on the face of it, Pharaoh's got to know that that's not true, right? But he doesn't do anything to the midwives. He doesn't punish the midwives. Actually, God rewards the midwives with households, right? And their names are recorded in Scripture for us to see. That they feared God instead of fearing Pharaoh. And that's how we are to be, right? We're not to fear men. And sometimes we fear men more than we fear God. I don't want to tell them about the gospel. They're in a wrong marriage. I can't go up and talk to them about that. They might not be my friend anymore. We worry more, we fear more men than we fear God, and it ought not be that way. And Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, right, don't fear those who can kill the body but can't do anything to your soul. You need to fear him who can throw both body and soul into hell. And we need to have more of a fear, more of a reverence for God than we do for mankind. Any last comments or questions? We got about a minute left according to my watch.
A half-truth is still
A half-truth is still a lie.
equivalent. You're trying to be deceptive.
Well, yeah. Now, God doesn't tell the enemy the battle plans, right? He didn't tell they weren't required to tell the people in Jericho that here's the battle plan, right? Not that anybody seemed to have asked them what they were doing. But, they weren't required. You're not always required to tell everybody about all of your business, right? But if you're doing something to lie or to steal and you think, well, that's okay because the situation warrants it, the Bible doesn't teach that. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. All right, it's 10:15.
Yeah, not revealing is not necessarily the same as deception.
Right.
There's a difference.
Because God tells Samuel when he goes to David's household to anoint David as king, he tells him, say that you're coming to offer a sacrifice, which he's actually coming to do. But he's not required to tell them the rest of his business.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for your attention and comment.